You're live. So it's right side up now, but I think when I go to the camera, or download it, flips it over.
Mm-hmm.
God, it was black. Today I got lost. So we got a few minutes. 2 minutes. Madison, you there?
Yeah.
Well. Both of you there in Olean. Jamestown, I'm missing one person, but we still have 1 minute. And it's still cold in this room. Maybe by Friday. It's supposed to be a little warmer outside. Oh. So let's see, Olivia Brooks. Cassandra Kelly. Anna Scholl. Megan Sapera. Anybody know Isabella Surma? Okay, so we did a lot of stuff on Friday. Let me put it up on the document camera, especially the bottom part. Now, see, this is one. Actually, it's not upside down, it's backwards. But it's right side. I should just look there, because if I look over here, I get completely confused. So, aren't these, oh, maybe that will help. So, we covered a lot of territory, and I used the notes on the pad just to orient you so that we didn't get too lost. So let me see if you've had a chance to do any of the reading, if you have any questions. And I got one question here. Go ahead, please.
Actually, I have a few.
Ooh, more than one. Cool. I like more than one.
First, I'll go to the reading. This is the first chapter.
Which book are you looking at?
The Modern Middle East.
Okay.
In chapter 1, the rise and expansion of Islam, it talks about how they had to make like agreements and governmental documents.
Who's they?
It says, in these commandments, the all-embracing nature of Islam was established. For example, contracting a debt agreement as the Quran required and writing before a witness was a religious duty, and failure to follow the prescription was a sin.
So which page are you on?
Number 11, it's at the very top. In this way, the details of marriage, inheritance, divorce, diet, and economic practices were made part of the religious experience of Muslim. Did they actually have to record their diet and let people know what they were eating?
Well, I thought you were starting, well, let me just make sure I can find where you are.
It's right at the top, the first paragraph.
And where it says,
11.
in these commandments?
Yes, and then to the bottom of the...
And they give you, they say, for example.
Mm-hmm.
Notice it says it was made part of the religious experience of Muslims. So when it says in this way, the details of marriage, inheritance, divorce, diet, and economic practice were made part of, but why were you thinking that you have to record it?
Well, I guess that it was up at the top. It said that you, contracting a debt agreement as the Quran required in writing before a witness. I didn't know if that included all those as well.
No, and at some point we'll probably do some classes on Islam, but Islam for me is almost as maybe as fascinating as Palestine. Islam, especially in, you have the Quran, which is supposedly God talking to the angel Gabriel to Muhammad, which was eventually written down. And then you also have something that's called a hadith, and we'll probably get into this, especially since you have good Islamic questions. The hadith is based on what the Prophet, may peace be upon him, which is the traditional way of referring to Muhammad, especially for practicing Muslims, talked about what the Prophet did. So Quran is what God is saying, this is what you got to do. And the hadith is what Muhammad actually did with it.
Oh, okay.
So in Islam, the Quran is the number one source. And some people say, well, it's like the Bible. Well, it isn't, because the Quran is God talking. The Bible is people writing allegedly inspired by God. And there's a Christian Bible and a Catholic Bible and a Jewish Bible. And there's books of the Bible that are included. Well, with the Quran, every Muslim reads the same Quran. Now, I have mine in both Arabic and English because I can't read Arabic. So the Quran, but the Quran is a lifestyle. It's not really a book. You're supposed to live the Quran. You can read it, but it's very difficult to read because it doesn't have a structure. It's not like it's telling stories like sometimes the Bible does. And saying stories doesn't mean to denigrate it. It's just, the Bible's full of lots of stories. The Quran really isn't that way. And in fact, if you read the Quran from the front to the back, it won't do you any good. The Quran goes in circles. And the reason for that is that God doesn't talk, if you believe in God, doesn't talk the way you and I do. I mean, because God is, all powerful and all knowing, and so how would we expect God to talk the way we mere humans do? So a good Muslim should know the Quran, but you never really know it. I think I gave the metaphor of the onion. You're always peeling it. And your job is to live it, not to read it. So there's that word jihad that sometimes has been misused to characterize war. And it could be used that way. But jihad means the person's struggle to understand God. And so you spend your entire life trying to understand God through the Quran. Now, the Quran, what people don't know, is the Quran actually sets up more rules about economics and business than it does about anything else. And one of the rules actually is that you're not supposed to borrow money. It's, that the part you talked about said a debt agreement. It's actually against the Quran for a Muslim to lend money and a Muslim to borrow money. It can be done, but you can't charge interest. It's considered like a gift. And there's a moral obligation on the debtor to give the money back. And the Quran says to avoid disputes, it is better to write it down than not. When it says here, contracting a debt agreement, because a debt agreement, they're not borrowing money, it's a gift that you're obligated to pay back. As the Quran required, it certainly says it's better. I'm not sure the Quran requires it, but the Quran definitely says it's better to write it down, which I guess is a requirement. And so it's a religious duty. And failure to follow a prescription was a sin. Well, if anybody was raised a Catholic like I was, there's two kinds of sins, venial and mortal. Islam has three classes of sin. And so there's one sin, if you will, that, if you don't follow it, don't worry. Now, there's another sin that if you do it, like if you're a Muslim, you're not allowed to kill anybody. This is why when you hear these Islamic terrorists advocating death, my response to them and the response of all Islamic scholars is that is not Islamic. So you're not supposed to be doing that. But there's a commandment, thou shalt not kill. Well, Moses is a prophet respected by Islam, so nobody's supposed to kill. And in fact, that's a really serious sin in Islam, because Islam says God will forgive you, God is merciful, but if you harm somebody, you have to get them to forgive you. Well, if you kill somebody, you can't get them to forgive you. Therefore, it's fascinating because even God can't spare you from eternal damnation. So if you kill somebody, you can't get forgiveness, and it limits God's ability to show mercy on you. Now, I think if you're a Christian, because Jews don't believe it now, if you kill somebody, or if you're a Catholic, like my tradition, you can go and confess the sin and be exonerated, and you can still go to heaven. You can't do that with Islam. Islam is very strict about that. Now, with the requirement of writing down a debt agreement, the Quran basically says I probably should, am I on camera? I guess so. Anyways, oh no, we got it on the students. It's best to do that. But if you don't do it, it's a minor sin. Mm-hmm. And the reason the Quran says it's best to do it is to avoid disputes. And in fact, the Quran says, though, it's best not to ever borrow any money. So the Quran basically says that the cause of all sin, it's pretty strong language, is borrowing money. So don't do it. But if you have to do it, it's better if you write it down, but don't you dare charge interest. But if you're the debtor, of course, you should give it back, and then as a gift, you should give someone additional, which is basically interest, but the creditor can't charge you interest, and you're giving a gift in gratitude. Mm-hmm. I mean, it gets quite complicated. So the Quran says it's better to write it down, but if you don't, you're not going to be subject to eternal damnation. So then when they said all that other stuff, you don't have to write all that down. Okay. The only reason you would write it down is to avoid disputes, because then people get angry, people might steal stuff, they might harm each other, they might even kill each other. And then, of course, if you kill somebody, that's it. Mm-hmm. You can't ever recover from that. Not at least in terms of eternal damnation. So I probably gave you a longer answer than maybe you wanted, but Islam is right just below Palestine is one of the things that I'm most fascinated with. And Islam is the fastest growing religion in the world. And it's the fastest growing religion in the United States. We may not have that many Muslims in Jamestown. I know there's more in Olean. There aren't that many in Dunkirk, but it is a worldwide phenomenon. So, and Muslims are like Christians. Lots of people are Christian and don't quite follow the rules. They bend them. And Muslims do that too. Muslims aren't supposed to have caffeine or alcohol. I have friends who are Muslim who don't drink coffee like I do. That's when I joked with you, I said I could never be a Muslim, it's too hard. I might be able to give up alcohol, but I don't want to give up coffee. Oh my God. So he made sort of a blanket statement without any real background, so I'm glad you asked that question. I hope I made it more clear than less clear. Mm-hmm. Islam is sometimes characterized to us, and if anybody's a Muslim, please tell me, because I don't want to teach you your religion. If you're not Muslim, and that might be all of us, we tend to think that Islam is this very rigid religion. And it really isn't. On some things it is. But on other things, it's really quite relaxed because the Quran set all these strict guidelines, but then Muhammad comes along and in the Hadith sort of softened the edges. So the Hadith based on the Prophet's actions is really quite relaxed. So I can't think of anything that we have in Christianity, except sometimes people want to interpret the biblical rules, especially the Old Testament stuff, really strictly. And then some Christian denominations say, well, you got to understand the culture. You don't really have to do that. And then you get some churches, like there's some people within the Catholic Church who try to make it even stricter, which basically makes no sense. But religion is always so complicated. So that other stuff you don't have to write down. You could if you want to, but you don't have to. Okay. It's just like in Islam, the Quran says men can marry as many women, I think up to 6, provided they can do justice to each of the wives. And most Muslims, including a scholar that we had here, Dr. Kidway from India, people, I took around the whole county and people say, well, how many wives do you have? And he says, I only have 1. And he said, well, they said, well, I thought the Quran said you could have up to 6. And he goes, yes, if you could do justice to them. And justice means you treat each one equally, you give as much attention to each one equally, you engage in marital intercourse with each one equally, nobody dresses better than the other. And he said, how in God's name, I don't think he said God's name, do you do that? He said, I have enough trouble doing justice to 1 woman. And she's complaining. So how do you do that with 6? So he said, yes, it's allowed, but most Muslims don't do that. On the other hand, then you got those terrorist guys who claim in the name of God that they can have as many women as they want. But then, they commit rape, which is within marriage, which is strictly prohibited. You don't do that. So Islam's complicated, but I think flexible. So I guess I started doing Islam 101, which is not a bad thing, but because if anybody wants to identify as a Muslim and correct me, that's fine with me. So you said you had more than one question?
Yes. Not about the reading.
Oh, okay.
The other day you talked about how after teaching this class, you would probably never be able to be allowed back into that area, either Islam or Palestine.
Well, I couldn't get into Palestine because I couldn't get into Israel.
Right. So.
There's a good chance I would, at some point, because people say you're going to go back, I would try. But if anybody gets wind of this course, especially because it's YouTube public, if they don't like the way I present Palestine, that is the Israeli government, I could end up on a list.
So now does our government care at all?
About what?
About you teaching this class about?
Gosh, I hope not. This is supposed to be the United States.
Right.
Well, the only extent to which they might care about it is because this administration is very cozy with the Israeli government, more so than any other administration. The American government wouldn't stop me from going, but I could get over there and be refused entry.
Okay.
Especially if I don't answer the questions properly. So I would just say I'm a school teacher if they ask, and I'm going to the Holy Land to see the religious and historical sites, which is what I did that trip. But if they find out I'm a college professor, I'll get pulled aside.
So now, if we were to Google and try to research more about Palestine and Palestinian culture and people, would we be red flagged by the Islamic government or our government? Yes, the Israeli government or our government.
The United States of America is not supposed to be following what people do, but if you're considered to be a risk, like there was that gun rally in Richmond, and prior to that, they were arresting Nazi leaders because we have neo-Nazis in the United States. Not for anything they said, but for what they were fearfully or were about to do based on comments they made. So the government of the United States does monitor extremists, especially because you got YouTube and Instagram and all this other stuff. It makes it relatively easy. I mean, just like the police monitor Facebook to hunt down drug vendors, that you can, and because it's public, you can read it, you can look at it. And the law enforcement authority would be foolish not to monitor that stuff. Mm-hmm. So somebody could be looking at this, and this is public. So how was your original question posted or positive?
So if we were to start researching on our own, like Google,
that somebody might know about that.
Yeah.
Yeah. I don't think they're gonna do that, mm-hmm. but I don't rule it out.
Right. Okay.
You know, if you get interested in Islam or Palestine, it might raise red flags. Now, I'm an academic and a scholar, I think, so I shouldn't bother them, but mm-hmm. the American government might be monitoring us. Yeah. Or at least me, maybe not you guys. Or they just don't care about me. It's hard to say.
Right. Okay.
But unfortunately, your U.S. government has been known to monitor people both legally and illegally. Mm-hmm. I mean, it's like if you go way not too far back, since we just had Dr. King's commemoration, the United States government illegally was keeping track of everything he did, including because he, being a human being, was unfaithful to his wife. And one of the ways they tried to keep him under control is they had recordings and pictures of him being unfaithful. I mean, to the point where they had pictures of him engaging in sexual intercourse with women, which I would suggest is none of the government's business. Now, some people say, well, that's done for. I hope so, but I don't entirely believe that they're not doing it. Mm-hmm. There's a legitimate role for monitoring, but there's a line you cross. But in the case of Dr. King, they use that stuff to try to control him. Mm-hmm. You know, if you go any further with your protests, we're going to give these pictures to your wife. Well, they shouldn't have had the pictures. Mm-hmm. It's wrong for him to have been unfaithful. It's kind of like Bill and Hillary Clinton, but that's between the two of them. Why is the government watching that stuff? Don't they have better things to do? Mm-hmm. So, yes, I mean, I'm a little bit paranoid because of working with my colleagues who have done more on Palestine or can just do Palestine, that they are being monitored, often by the American government and the Israeli government. Mm-hmm. Just like if you're a Palestinian, you're a scholar, you are getting monitored. There's no doubt about it. But one of the magazines that I really like, I have my own subscription to it. I don't think we have it in the library, but it's called Washington Report on Middle Eastern Affairs. It is written from a pro-Palestinian perspective, and at the top you say, does the U.S. care about human rights in the Middle East, which is provocative enough, but because you brought up this notion of observing Israeli spyware operating in a city near you. The Israelis have developed a very sophisticated system for keeping track of people in Palestine and Israelis, and this article now, it's subject to further consideration, but the article talks about how the Israeli government is cooperating with the state of Virginia, which I just came back from, to monitor people who are doing things that the Israeli government prefers that they wouldn't, and they're using, high-tech technology. So they shouldn't be doing that in the United States. What they do in their country, probably they shouldn't be doing either. So with technology today, it's getting easier and easier. But then lots of us, I go on Facebook just to make announcements sometimes. I don't really like Facebook. Some of you might be on Instagram. At some point, any of that stuff can be watched by legitimate governments for the wrong reason. So I read this magazine quite regularly, and it feeds my paranoia, I guess. But so I think, in the United States, I think it's a violation of the First Amendment because you have the right to free speech. But for example, there's neo-Nazi encampments in Michigan and Idaho that the FBI has consistently kept an eye on because they're heavily armed and they're predicting a race war. And as soon as the race war starts, they're going to start shooting. And we know they have weapons that they're not supposed to have, but you can't go onto the grounds because they have a right to preach hatred. And so they're neo-Nazis, and they say death to blacks, death to Jews, death to homosexuals, because that's contaminating America. Should belong to white, straight people who are Christian. Doesn't sound very Christian to me to go around killing everybody. But those groups exist. And so I like the government monitoring them if they do it within the constraints of the First Amendment. Or the Fourth Amendment, where you can't go on there without a search warrant. That's kind of chilling. I don't want you all guys to go paranoid on me and not research, but I think for the most part, they're not going to keep track of undergraduates who aren't international relations majors, especially at a community college. But I don't know. I've been monitored for lots of activities over the years because, I was anti-war during Vietnam, pro-LGBTQ rights all of my life. I know there's a file on me somewhere that never did anything against me, but I don't entirely, I don't like not trusting my own government, but at times I don't. So again, I'm not trying to make you guys paranoid or freak you out. It's still better to do, don't not do research because of this, because knowing is always better than not knowing. But at some point, So I hope that helps or makes it worse.
Yeah, thank you.
This magazine is excellent. I used to buy it at the newsstand, but then I liked it so much I just started buying it myself. And it is pro-Palestine, there's no doubt about it. Did you have another question?
Nope, that was it.
Did you have a question?
Yeah. In the last Earth, it was talking about, I'm probably going to say these names wrong, I apologize.
That's all right, I probably can't pronounce them either, so don't feel bad.
It was talking about Khalid's dad being named Jamal after this Egyptian leader, and then it just briefly mentions that he suffered some sort of painful and humiliating defeat. And I was wondering if you had more background on that.
What page are you on?
Page 7 and last Earth, 7 on 8.
Page 7?
Yeah, bottom of page 7, and it carries over to page 8. It talks about this Egyptian leader named Jamal.
Yeah, in sync with the political mindset of most refugees, the name Jamal was bestowed upon him. Muhammad believed that the charismatic Egyptian leader Jamal Abdel Nasser was ready to liberate their land and facilitate the most important thing in the world, their return to Palestine. Heartache befell Muhammad when Nasser died soon after a painful and humiliating defeat in 1967, as the rest of Palestine was conquered by the ever-expanding state of Israel. Nasser was someone who tried to bring the Arabs together because the Arabs right now are still split between countries. And so Nasser, it's the pan-Arabic movement. He tried to bring all the Arabs of that part of the world to basically get rid of the Jews in Israel. There's no doubt about it. I mean, Nasser was certainly ready to kill all the Jews and destroy Israel. But Nasser's goal as an Egyptian was to try to bring all the Arabs together. And for a while, he actually succeeded, but the references to the 1967 war, when the Arabs got together and attacked Israel, and Israel, with the help of the United States, successfully defeated them and expanded their control of the territory, which is the West Bank, which is basically Palestine. And so the Arabs underestimated the ability of the Israeli Defense Forces at that time. And the '67 war led to an expansion of what's called Eretz Israel, which just means the land of Israel. So I wasn't sure what kind of background you wanted.
Yeah, just anything more than what it said. I just didn't know who he was or why he was important to them.
Yeah, and there's probably stuff, I'm sure there's stuff about this in the history of the Middle East, because it would talk about the '67 war, and it would talk about Nasser's attempt to bring, in fact, in History of the Modern Middle East, there's chapter 15, the Middle Age in the age of Nasser, who was an Egyptian, and 16, the Middle East in the age of Nasser, the radicalization of Arab politics. So basically what he did as an Arab leader was try to bring the Arabs together, because he said that's why we can't defeat Israel. And he was successful in bringing them together, but then the war was a serious miscalculation. The Israelis had a much better air force and much better fighters, because they're fighting to keep their land, and the Arabs are fighting to push them off and get them out. And the Israelis fought back very effectively, again with the help of the United States. So Nasser, well, first, this is almost starting to become ancient history, was maybe the last Arab ruler to bring the Arab world together. Because we're back to Egypt and Jordan and Syria and Lebanon and, Iraq, because Iran's Persian, it's not Arabic. There's a lot of disunity in the Arab world. The Arab world is clearly not monolithic. And not all Arabs are Muslims, but like in Palestine's case, I think it was like 80% of the Palestinian Arabs were Muslim. So Nasser might be a hero in the Arab world, but he's certainly considered to be evil on the Israeli side, because he was trying to kill you, get rid of you. I would probably, somebody tried to kill me, get rid of me, I think that was evil. But he was motivated by what we call pan-Arabism, but it didn't work. And this is fascinating, because there's a lot of difference among people who are Arabs. Israel tended to think that there's a word that's used, and it relates to the notes that I put here. Let me just go back to that. So I'm gonna fit this in, but the early Zionists used to refer to Arabs as fungible. Anybody know what fungible means? Or have any idea what fungible is? Anybody in Dunkirk or Olean know what fungible means? It's what? Say that again, I'm sorry.
Sounds like fickle.
Did you say fickle?
Yeah.
Well, no, but nice try, thank you. Fungible means, because I also teach law, in business law, a fungible good is something that it doesn't matter, and it's usually used referring to agricultural products. So, milk is milk is milk, corn is corn is corn. If you can't get the corn from farmer A, you go and get the same corn from farmer B, because it's fungible. The early and there's two strains of Zionism, but one of the strains of Zionism regarded Arab peoples as fungible and said, well, it doesn't matter where they live, which is one of the justifications for pushing 750,000 Palestinians out of Palestine. Their position was that Arabs are fungible. All Arabs are the same. So it doesn't matter where they live, whether it's Palestine or Egypt or Iraq, because an Arab is an Arab is an Arab. Well, the problem with that would be saying like all Americans are the same. Clearly we're not. I mean, even if you're a white American, you know, there's differences between a New Yorker and a South Carolinian. I mean, there's accents, there's preferences. And so, you know, move me someplace else because, you know, Americans are fungible. Well, we're not. Palestinians and Arabs aren't fungible either. But it was based on the idea that an Arab is an Arab is an Arab. And so if he lives in Africa, Europe, or Asia, it doesn't really matter. We can push him around and move him. So I forgot what was the question.
I was just asking about Nasser.
Oh, okay, I'm sorry. How did I get into fungibility? Because yeah, and even Nasser to a certain extent misunderstood that. He thought he could bring the Arab world together because all Arabs hated Jews in Israel. Well, that wasn't the case. So he was trying to bring together Arabs of different cultures. So, you know, early Zionists said Arabs were fungible. But I think to go back to Nasser, I think Nasser took that opinion too. It didn't matter if you were an Egyptian or a Jordanian or an Iraqi. If you were Arab, you were Arab, you were Arab, you were fungible. And so you have the same beliefs and the same cause, and you want to get into this fight. Well, it didn't work out too well. Now, in Nasser's case, the Soviet Union was helping him. Israel's case, the United States was helping them. So to a certain extent, it was seen as what we call a proxy war, rather than the United States or the USSR actually fighting it out. We had regional conflicts like Vietnam, which was backed by the Chinese communists, and then Vietnam backed by the United States. It was basically a war between the United States and China, or Korea. But the '67 war was basically a war between the United States and the USSR without either of us committing ground troops. So it was a proxy war, and the attitude was, well, Arabs are fungible. And I think Nasser misunderstood his own people, if you want to call it that. Because it's like saying Christians are fungible. Well, I think there's a big difference between the Southern Baptist and the Catholic. And people need to understand that. Or it's like, it doesn't happen so much anymore, but some white people used to say very racist things to me because they thought, well, I'm white, I must agree with them, and I'd have to correct them and say, I'm sorry, but that's racist. I'm not going to listen to that. Cut it out. But they just assume, well, I'm white, so I'm fungible. I must be racist. Well, so I think Nasser made the mistake of seeing Arabs as fungible, but then Zionism saw it that way too. So Nasser's story, because you know there's 2 chapters, is very complex, and I would urge you to read that. But '67 was a great failure on the part of the Arab world, led by Nasser, and a great success for the Israelis because they defeated the Arabs, which pretty much put an end to any kind of organized effort by the Arabs to destroy Israel. And then Israel added the West Bank, which is basically Palestine, which to a certain extent exacerbated the entire problem. And it was actually a little later, but it in the 70s especially, but that Nasser's defeat ended up in the temporary occupation, which is, the temporary occupation is still going on now. You know, it's actually longer than '67 because it started in '47, but '67 expanded the geographical area. So some Arabs blamed Nasser for this horrendous defeat, which then allowed Israel to expand its borders and increase the temporary occupation. I don't know how you can have a temporary occupation that is longer than I'm alive. But it's there, so hopefully that helps. But I would urge you to read the Nasser chapters. I think Nasser, with some Arabs, is still regarded as a hero, but others as a failure. And I'm sure with Israelis that they often argue, see, what happens if we let them get power, they will kill us and they will try to come together to kill us. And they got a legitimate point. because they did try to go. And both sides basically thought Arabs were fungible, but they're not. Anybody else have a question? While I take a sip of my coffee, because I can't become a Muslim.
I have another one too, if nobody else has one.
Say what?
I have another question. if
Oh,
nobody else
sure,
has one.
absolutely.
Not related to the reading, but I've been wondering, like, just when you're talking about visiting, like, Israel and Palestine, do you think it's more challenging or even more dangerous, like, if you are a woman who wanted to, like, visit there? Or is there, like, more precautions you have to take, or is it equal?
I don't think it's more dangerous, but we were advised in our security conference that women are much more likely to be held up at the border and taken into the interrogation, which sounds awful, but I mean, they just ask you questions. Women are more likely to be taken into the interrogation room because they tend to be sexist, especially if you look at the Orthodox rabbis who pretty much currently run the Israeli government, who, you know, men and women have to be kept separate. So if you go to the Wailing Wall in Jerusalem, one of the most religious sites in all of Judaism, because it's the wall that's left over from the temple that was built way back when, men are allowed to pray at the wall, and women have to go behind a screen in a little area, and so you can't mix the genders. So women are often suspect. But you know, you sort of get the same problem if anyone's ever been to a mosque. The women always pray, the men go in front and the women go behind. So then you get this argument, well, Islam doesn't respect women, but my suggestion would be Orthodox rabbis, many of them don't even want women at the Wailing Wall, even behind the little screen. And sometimes this resulted in violence, which seems a paradox because you're talking about religion. The current government is misogynist. This doesn't mean that all Israelis don't like women, because there's a lot of secular Israelis who don't like this. But women have to be kept separate, women are considered inferior, and this biblical hangover, and our secretary, when she looked at the class list, she said, how come everybody in the Palestine class is female? I said, I don't know, you have to ask them. None of the males want to take the class. I don't know why. Anyways, women are understood to be impure because you menstruate. And that hangs over everything, including Judaism, Islam, Christianity. You know, like originally women weren't allowed to vote in the United States because you menstruate, and so not only are you illogical because your hormones are all screwed up. I always wonder what they thought about after menopause. Would you then calm down? And I'm not female, so I don't know, but, the bleeding was considered to be impure. That's why, you know, there are all these rules about temple and church and mosque while you're menstruating. Because there's like this fear of blood, but it's a normal biological process. And it has to happen, and, you know, but this stuff hangs over. And so, they advised the women that they had to be extra careful, and then they were advised the black women to be super careful because it's also often racist. So I identify as a male, I appear to be a male, which I am, and I'm white, and I have a last name that's Arabic and Jewish, because it means Lord in Arabic, but it's also a Jewish word. So I sailed in. But I think I told you my black friend, the PhD from Indiana, had a lot of trouble. Oh, there was a black academic woman with us, but she sailed in too. So, you know, are they more racist or misogynist? It's a real problem when you combine the two. They're not the only society that discriminates. Because we're only now celebrating the 100th anniversary of giving women in the United States the right to vote. So, yes.
Do you have to like dress a certain way while you're there, like either as a man or a woman?
Typically, no. I mean, if you see somebody very religiously orthodox, Well, in the Orthodox Judaism, these are the guys with the black hats and the black coats and the hair curling down and the prayer shawl that sometimes comes out from under their shirt. And then the women have to be very modest. Among Muslims, women are supposed to be modest. That's why you get the extreme of women being covered except for the little, they can look out. That's not really a religious requirement. The Quran, for example, says women should be modest because men can't control their sexual urges. So you cover up women, not because women are inferior, but because actually men are inferior. So if you go to mosque, the reason the men pray in front and the women pray in back, and sometimes there's even a physical barrier, as long as they can see a speaker during the sermon, it's because women are able to control their sexual urges. Whereas if you flipped it, you put the men in the back and the women in the front, everybody's prostate laying down on the ground, the men can't control themselves. Now, it's kind of sexist at first. When I study Islam and we've had female Islamic scholars, they almost always, if they wear a dress, will have it down to their ankles. And certainly don't show cleavage, but not all of them wear a veil or, cover the whole face except for their eyes. But it's to keep men from lusting, because men can't control their sexual urges. Although, in Christianity, it's kind of the opposite. The women are the lustful ones. Women, you guys lead us men astray. So even if you go to the biblical story, it's Eve who tempts Adam into eating the apple. And then they lose paradise and we have to suffer still. And why? Because of Eve. She was evil. The Quran has a similar story because you got Adam and Eve. The difference is in the Quranic story, Adam and Eve both eat of the forbidden fruit. So Eve is not a temptress. They both decide to violate God's law. So pox on both of their houses. But in the Christian and Jewish version, the only reason we're all suffering today in this human condition is because all of you, it's not me talking, all of you, you're women, and you lead us nice, virtuous men astray. In Islam, they both screw up. But I like both stories because probably most of you are raised as Christian, and so of course God gets upset because we want to be godlike and have this knowledge that he has, and so he throws us out of paradise, we discovered we're naked, and then all hell breaks loose. I like the Islamic story better because both of them do it together. One's not misleading the other. And then when God finds out, they say, gee, God, we're sorry. And God says, don't worry about it. Although I get Christians very upset when I say, well, you realize Muslims and Christians are praying to the same God. And I said, well, they have to because you're both monotheistic. There's only one. But in the Muslim biblical story, God, I like God much more in the Muslim story because he said, don't worry about it. Whereas the Christian and Jewish God gets really mad, and then of course he makes childbirth painful because why? Because you evil women were the ones who brought the downfall, not us virtuous men, which is nonsense. I mean, I don't mean to offend anybody's religious beliefs, but the God of Islam is much more cozy. It's kind of like, you're not going to condemn to hell if you can get the person you wronged to forgive you. If he forgives you, it's okay, don't worry about it. So God, in fact, the very first part of the Quran talks about God being merciful, which I think it was last year when Pope Francis declared the Christian Year of Mercy and our Catholic, and I think he did it actually quite deliberately. Because I would talk to my Catholic students, I said, well, what did Pope Francis do? They said it was the Year of Mercy. I said, well, that's very Islamic. And Pope Francis has been criticized for being too cozy with the Muslims. But I think he understands that Islam is not that different. So I always say Islam has a lot in common. Now, In fact, I think Islam treats women better. Now, some Muslims don't, but Islam treats women better than typically Christianity or Judaism. And with those Orthodox rabbis, you know, if you're, well, but they treat everybody badly because men and women, in order to get married in Israel, you have to do it in front of an Orthodox rabbi. And if you're not Orthodox, they won't marry you. So most secular Jews leave the country, get married, and come back. And, you know, so it's really bizarre. And sexism hangs its ugly head over a lot of this stuff. But I think a lot of the treatment of women by Muslims is misinterpreted. Like you can have 6 wives, if you could do justice. They got to pray in the back, but that's because the men will be filled with lust and forget about their prayers, whereas women can keep focused. Or women have to cover up because the men will get carried away, or, you know, so, and I know I'm gonna run out of time, but I really love your questions. You know, if you go back to the story, when Muhammad goes to the cave and he hears voices, God speaking through the angel Gabriel, and he thinks he's going crazy, and he goes home and he tells his wife, he goes, I think I'm losing my mind. I keep hearing these voices saying that this is God talking to you through the angel, and there's something wrong with me. And his wife says to him, no, you idiot. Oh, only she could get away with calling the prophet an idiot. No, you idiot. That's God. Go back and listen. So Muhammad goes back to the cave, listens, and comes back and says, look, I know you told me that's God, but that can't be. I'm losing my mind. And so he relates what he's being told. And she said, oh my God. I don't think she said OMG, but oh my God, that's God talking. Go back there. So the reason I relate that story is that if his wife hadn't said to him, look, I know that's God and you don't, it establishes, in one respect, the superiority of women. You know, in Christianity, Mary gives birth to Jesus, the Savior, and that's the end of her role. I mean, she raises him and all that stuff. And of course, goes through the agony of watching him die. But in Islam, it's his wife who's first recognized. He didn't know that this was God. And so I've been taught by female Muslim scholars who say that, in fact, as women, they feel more valued as Muslims. Because his wife was the first one to figure it out. If he went on his own authority, there would never be any Islam. Which, you know, if you're anti-Islam, that would be a relief, but it's not. He was, I don't want to say stupid because I don't want to insult the prophet. He was unable to understand that God was talking to him, whereas she knew right away. She just knew as soon as she heard what he was saying. Oh my God, that is God. So, and I realized, but you know what? We got a lot to do, obviously, in the course of this course. But I'm glad you're doing the reading, and I love your questions, and I never want to stymie that because there's so much to know. It's almost impossible. So we'll just keep doing our best. So thank you for doing the reading. Continue to do the reading. We'll come back on Swell Friday. I'll be happy to take questions. If not, we'll go back to the notes because I got to do some more with Zionism. So have a swell afternoon or whatever it is that's happening. It's already, well, no, not quite. Swell. Yeah, something like Nasser. I mean, I was in high school when that happened, so it's part of my life. That's how I know I'm getting old. Everything that I thought, it just happened. I had my 50 reunion in high school, so I realized high school didn't just happen. And so my classmates have died. Well, life indeed goes on. Thank you. She stole your job.
Yeah, it's okay.
You got a real team going.